Welcome to today's webinar on digital identity in banking. My name's Claire Cox and I work for the technology consultancy Scott Logic. Following our recent appointment by the Scottish Government to build their digital identity platform, we've been inviting industry experts to join us in these online forums to explore the topic in depth, as it's an area of relevance to the whole economy and it's constantly evolving. Now, you might have seen a recent panel discussion that we held to discuss digital identity in government with panellists from the Scottish Government, the DWP and GDS. If you missed that webinar, you can still watch it on the Scott Logic YouTube channel, and I'll post the link in the event description below. So in this webinar, we'd like to explore digital identity in banking, which is another sector that Scott Logic works very closely with. And so I'm delighted to be joined by Martin Ingram, Product Owner for Identity and Access Management at Natwest. Martin, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll jump straight in if that's okay with you. So can you tell me a bit about yourself and your role at Natwest, and give us a brief potted history of digital identity at Natwest?
Yes, okay, and perhaps a little bit broader as well. So, hello everybody, I'm Martin Ingram. I am Product Owner for Identity and Access Management at Natwest. Today I do speak as a private individual, so don't confuse anything I say as being an official statement from Natwest. But fundamentally, I spend my time looking at what we do with identity for the bank, across all our services, across both our customer and our colleague-facing systems. A few years back, I started to realize that there was an opportunity to help our customers in a new way. And I started looking for others that were thinking similarly. And basically, if you look at where we are in terms of the internet, it was created with the idea of anonymity, which is really nice. You know, it adds lots of freedom. But the problem is that it can be really difficult to actually understand who you're dealing with. And if you look at a lot of the challenges that we typically have as users, as citizens using the internet, a lot of them are tied up with how do I know how does an organization know who I am? And how do I know I'm really talking to the right organization? So it's essentially an identity problem. And I started airing these views and basically looking for like-minded individuals across industries, basically. So not just financial, but more broadly. And I found actually that I was pulling on a thread of wool, if you will, and very quickly I found that there were large groups who were interested in what we could potentially do in this space, both from within banking and more broadly. So fundamentally, in order that we can trust, we need to know what we are trusting. And the point we're at, I suppose, is that banks have to trust, because fundamentally trust is part of how we manage risk. And our regulators tell us that we need to manage those risks. And so we need to know who it is we're transacting with. And some of that falls down to things like anti-money laundering, some of it down to that's just basic fraud, you know, keeping the fraud losses within appetite. But we do this work, but if you look more broadly, then there's lots of other organizations that also attempt to identify people to manage their fraud risk or meet a regulatory requirement. So for instance, if you look at a typical account opening journey with a financial institution, you typically have to show a government issued ID, be it a driving license or a passport, and a utility bill. And then in the background, the organization does some checks. Yep. Now, in the days of COVID, it's very difficult to actually get into a branch and show a physical government document. And so we've moved to more electronic approaches to that, some of which are pretty good. It's still not the same sort of strength as having a branch member take a look at a document, photocopy it, and sign the photocopy. But it's pretty good. But if you look at the other aspects of it, proof of address, which is what the utility bill check's about, then, well, I don't know about you, but I don't get utility bills anymore. They're all online. And actually, what you're really taking in for your identity check is something that you printed out on your home printer on your whatever choice of paper you chose to use. So there's no easy way to test veracity. And actually, most school kids could create a utility bill if you asked them to. You know, it's not that hard. And so how strong is that as a proof of address? Now, going forward, of course, once a user's onboarded and they've passed the other checks, then we as banks, we start to build up a history with that user that further corroborates the evidence they provided in the first instance. Sometimes things change and data will always be, you know, right to a particular proportion, but fundamentally we start to build a picture that becomes quite strong. Okay, so that's us. You know, you've onboarded to a bank, but it's not one and done, because then you go and look at, say, I don't know, getting a mobile network contract. Well, guess what? They're going to ask for a government issued ID and a utility bill to check that, you know, giving you a handset's a reasonable bet. Well, that's a waste of effort, added friction, and it's not terribly effective for the reasons I described. So why can't we start to use the trust that you've built up inside the bank to help you in your broader digital journeys? So as you go to the mobile network operator, why not say, okay, I have an identity, it's with NatWest, onboard me. And as long as the relying party accepts the evidence we provide and goes, okay, that's good enough for the risk we're taking here, then that can reduce the friction and potentially also better manage their risks, because remember, the utility bill is just something you printed out at home, right? And then it starts to get broader than that. Supposing you could start to bring in attributes that came from multiple places, and you know, there's different technologies you can look at underneath this, but let's think about this purely from the what is it we're trying to achieve. But if you start to be able to bring multiple pieces, multiple attributes from multiple providers, then you start to be able to deliver that, you know, lower friction journey and that better management of risk in a wider range of use cases. Thinking about some of the things that are out there at the moment, supposing you're looking to remortgage your house and you have a current account at one bank, you're looking to mortgage at another bank. If you can prove that you have an account at that other bank and a history associated with it, you can probably prove your salary level and your employment from that bank. But actually, if you could also include a statement from an attribute in the land registry that actually said you own the property that you're attempting to remortgage, then suddenly you've got proof that actually it's a mortgage, you're a good person, and it's a mortgage on a property that you own. And that takes a lot of the blockers out of the way in terms of onboarding customers and understanding the risk. Now, that's very much financial services based, but actually as we start to look at the broader world out there, then there's many cases where being able to attach multiple attributes together builds you a journey that could be far simpler and far less trouble than it's been in the past. So if you think about going away on holiday and renting a car, yeah, so a car rental journey. You know, typically, you get off a plane and you stand in line at car rental for usually quite a while for them just to check your documents, try and sell you an upgrade, and them to give you the keys. But if you could ahead of time share a government issued ID, so a driving license that proves you can drive, an identity that's associated with that, and proof of credit, then actually that journey at car rental becomes far quicker. I'm sure they'll still try to sell you an upgrade, but actually all the paperwork and signing stuff can be done completely online and not at the point where you're just trying to get out of the airport. So you start to be able to enable all sorts of journeys that reduce customer friction and reduce and improve our ability to manage fraud. So that's really the opportunity that's with digital identity. Multiple attributes across multiple providers that helps deliver customer journeys.
What difference will this make to people's lives? Can you describe some other use cases for this new approach to identity assurance and the benefits it'll bring to customers, businesses, and the economy?
Okay, so let's start with customers. From a customer perspective, what you'll see is lower friction. So as you attempt to do something, you don't end up doing, at the lowest level, you don't end up putting your details in over and over again. Now that's fairly low level. And actually, if you look at some payment providers like PayPal, they're pretty good actually at providing your details into commerce sites. But that pre-completion of details is a given. But because there's actually trust behind it, then that starts to take some of the rest of the friction out of the journey as the organization you're trying to work with as an individual tries to make sure that actually it really is you. So things like sending you a pin to go, is this really you? And it starts to become less important because you know that you're dealing with a strong identity. So you actually benefit from the fact that the fraud is reduced, and therefore the journey doesn't need to try and mitigate that fraud. As an organization, then you should get lower dropouts because customers aren't left at that, oh my God, how do I prove my income to this? And one of the challenges with mortgage journeys is typically that it takes so long for people to find all the paperwork that frequently they have to pause and resume multiple times. And every time that happens, then a significant proportion of customers just won't bother. They'll go somewhere else. So that starts to improve. Even simpler journeys than that, the fact that there's so much to do can be a blocker. I know that for myself, if I'm on a website and I'm looking to find out what the shipping charge is, and it's going to ask me to fill in details and things just to find out whether it's free or £3.95, then I probably won't bother, right? And so that's a drop, it's a dropout in those cases. So organizations will see that their dropout rate decreases. They'll also see their fraud decrease because they know they're dealing with a real individual. From the point of UK itself, there's a really interesting report that came out from McKinsey's, the consultants, in 2019. That called out that potentially UK could see a 3% increase in GDP in 2030 if a digital identity was enabled by government. So that's not government doing digital identity, but them enabling a commercially led digital identity. Now, you look at the numbers in there, and it's about 50–60% toward that, the value is to the individual, and about 40% of the value comes to the organizations. But in any case, that's a significant amount of additional GDP that will be enabled by having a digital identity.
At Natwest Group, you're collaborating with other banks to define and implement a new vision for digital identity assurance. What's motivated you all to work together, and what is the new vision?
Okay, so let's take an example. I'm going to make it a fictional bank. Let's say we've got this fictional bank and we've got 20% of retail customers, say, as a number. And also we have 20% of commercial customers. Now, I mentioned earlier on that for this to work, you need that trust exists. And trust has to exist between both parties in this. So it needs to be in the individual, is the individual who they say they are, and also in the relying party. So we need to be sure that when an individual shares data, they're sharing it with the organization they think they are. And we see lots of cases where that isn't the case nowadays. So if you think about those scam calls that come in and say, hey, it's your bank calling, just tell us your PIN and your account details, or the stuff that turns up in SMSs at the moment that says, this is the post office, you need to give us 10 quid to have your parcel released. What's the reason those work is because there's no trust associated with the relying party. So in order that we can have a digital identity ecosystem that works, you need that the individual's trusted and the entity's trusted. Now, let's go back to our fictional bank, 20% of retail, 20% of commercial. If you're a typical customer, just randomly picked, and you're looking to deal with any particular commercial randomly picked, at that 20% level, then if you look at the proportion of instances where the customer would be within that 20%, and the commercial would be in that. It's 20% times 20%, so 0.2 times 0.2, 0.04. So only in 4% of cases are you going to be able to say, I can trust the individual and I can trust the receiver. So what that's telling us basically is that we need to have a larger proportion of individuals and a larger proportion of commercials so that this becomes useful. And fundamentally, that's why it makes sense for banks to work together on this, because only by doing so can we get to a result that works for the consumer. And also we start from a relying party perspective. It becomes very obvious that there is a leading scheme. There's a scheme that they can and should align to. So adoption becomes more useful. And that's just the same for individuals as well. If you go to individuals and say, hey, sign up for this, in 4% of cases it may be useful, then people are going to go look at it and go, maybe in some other day. And adoption is key to solutions like this. So fundamentally, that's why it needs to be multiple banks working together if we want a solution that's based on bank ID.
Traditional forms of identity verification can present obstacles to people trying to access services. But on the other hand, digital literacy and access to technology can also be barriers. How will the bank's new approach to digital identity assurance address inclusion?
Yes, inclusion's, I think inclusion's one of the areas where digital identity can really help, because inclusion is many things. People are excluded in many different ways, and sometimes it's through disability, sometimes it's through technical knowledge or access to technology. But we're looking at how we can work across particularly government organizations that can establish identity even outside of the rigidity of a passport and driving license. If you don't have passport and driving license, you're kind of up a creek at the moment. But there are parts of government that are very good, very strong at establishing identity that would allow us to bring inclusion to people who are excluded at the moment. And I suppose the other thing that we have as banks is we have this broad network of physical presence that can potentially help people as they're going on those journeys. I think the key to this is understanding the forms of exclusion that exist today. Why people are excluded. Are they excluded because they can't get to a physical place? Is it they can't use a particular form of technology for one reason or another, or something else? And how do we mitigate that? But I think there's a lot of opportunity here for digital identity to help people become more digitally enabled and benefit more from society.
What are the main challenges in implementing this new approach to digital identity assurance, and how do they need to be addressed?
There's a number of challenges, some of which are quite foundational. So where does things like liability sit? And some of that will come out of the trust framework. There's also just understanding what's the right solution. And that's where testing and learning becomes so critical, because this is a new offering. We can point to what's happened abroad, but UK is frequently a bit different. And we need to understand what it is we offer. And in particular, what are the use cases that people will use most often? So what are they going to value and do this frequently? If you look at a lot of the attempts to do this in the past, what's happened is that they've become solutions that have perhaps been used a few times a year. And at that point, it's not really solving a problem, because what you've done effectively is you've created a new account for users to try and remember how to access. And it's not opened up and solved a problem where people go, oh, I know how to do that. I'll just use my digital identity because I know what I'm doing with that, and I do it, all the time. If you look at, say, like a mobile banking user, they typically use the mobile banking app 2 or 3 times a week on average. most of the previous attempts at digital identity have been about things where you infrequently need to use it. If we can move it to be a part of just how you do stuff going forward, so you use it to access websites, you use it to get to, you know, the websites where typically you go, oh, I've forgotten the password for that, so I'll do forgotten password, right? And it starts to open up that frequency of use and just being part of the user's life, then we start to get to a point where the adoption can really flourish. So we're working through the testing in terms of use cases, what it needs to be to understand it and deliver on that. So there are a number of areas we need to work on. There is an understanding that it's something that we do need to do and need to do reasonably quickly, which is keeping us focused. But there are problems to be addressed.
What's the roadmap for implementing this new approach to digital identity with your fellow banks? And is there good practice overseas that you can learn from?
Interesting. I mean, you know, we're investigating at the moment and we're testing some things. There's a lot happening in this space, both within UK and internationally. There are some good examples externally. I can point to examples in the Nordics, which is mainly government-led, in Belgium and Holland, which is more bank-led, and Canada, where bank and government are working together to bring those parts together. I think the opportunity here is a little bit different in that it would span the banks with some government plus commercial organizations, because I think that's what drives the frequency of use that's so important to this. So we're testing on that basis. There are international conversations happening on this in terms of what would an international standard for bank-based ID look like. There's also standards organizations that we're part of and contribute to that are UK and international based. So there's a lot of activity happening in that space, really trying to pick a solution that works and which is sustainable, so drives that frequency of use. When will we get there? Well, we're testing at the moment and we're looking to try and get to production as quickly as we can. There is some work that's going on within government that will help here. So the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport is looking to enable a trust framework for the UK that will create the groundings under which individual schemes will fit. Now, why that's useful is because it brings with it some changes that would allow a digital identity to be regarded as in the same as strong as and as credible as a traditional paper-based document. That's important. It's not a requirement for some of the early stuff we do, but it's a requirement at the point where we need to be able to remove the requirement to say go through anti-money laundering checks using paper documents every time you want to hire a solicitor or an accountant or in property transactions and things like that. So that's a statutory presumption, they call it, will come, and that is timetabled at the moment, and that'll help with the overall evidential weight. Some of it's pure technology challenges and working at what people really want. You know, we're doing tests with customers, with tests with technology, really understanding how we can help. What does a solution need to be? How does it need to work? Does it need to work offline? How much is it about just being able to go, yep, it's Martin, and how much is it about quality and a mix of attributes? So some testing to be done, but we're very keen that we get there quickly and start to benefit UK citizens.
And the final question, Martin, what does the future hold? What would it take for there to be a single approach to digital identity assurance across all sectors of the economy?
That's an interesting one. And, you know, all sectors, I think, is doable. And I suppose the elephant in the room here is government. So how do we bring government into this? And there are multiple conversations happening in this space, but we also see, you know, one login to government, which is, you know, perhaps a bit to one side. And I think what I'm keen to do is understand how we can bring that closer to a commercially offered, a broad multi-sector solution. And so what are the links between the two? How does data from government play into a commercially delivered solution? But in terms of sectors, then digital identity should be able, a commercially offered digital identity should be able to reach into every sector. And it's really down to the sector understanding the value. And actually, from the conversations I've had with quite a broad range of commercials, they understand what this can do, and they're very keen to adopt. The other question is, how does this work internationally? And there's really two levels to that. One is, how does the technology work internationally? And that's basically about standards. And there's conversations happening on that, and that can happen one way or another. Either there's a common standard, or there's a way of translating from one to the other. The other aspect is, what does the legal framework look like? What does the regulatory framework underpinning schemes in different countries look like? So as you cross jurisdictions, what is the meaning of an identity, and can it really be used? Can it be trusted? Some of this might go to de facto, i.e. businesses will go, okay, we understand what happens in this region, and we're okay with it, we'll accept it from the point of view of harm management and risk. But there's a bigger, longer term question of, what's the weight of a digital identity across countries? In Europe, EIDAS is looking to define that for European countries. But other countries, it's still a game to be played at this stage. I don't think it's something we need to have an answer to at this point, because to solve that without first solving the individual single jurisdiction problem is putting the cart before the horse. But it will come up very quickly that we need to understand what the legal basis of identity is across jurisdictions.
Thank you so much, Martin. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us today. And all that leaves for me to say is thank you to you too for watching. And if you'd like to share your insights or carry on the conversation, do feel free to get in touch using the email address claire@scottlogic.com. But that's it from me. So thank you, Martin, and bye for now.
Thank you all.